I didn't have time for nonsense that night. My shift had just ended at the rundown diner where I worked, my shoes soaked through from a leaking kitchen pipe. I was exhausted, barely scraping by with tips that wouldn't even cover a full meal. And yet, just as I was about to walk home in the pouring rain, life decided to throw me another curveball. A sleek black sports car sat on the curb, hazard lights blinking. Standing beside, it was a woman in her mid-20s, dressed like she had never known struggle. Expensive heels, a designer coat, and an expression that screamed annoyance. "You," she snapped, pointing at me like I was her servant. "Do you know anything about cars? My stupid driver is late, and this piece of junk won't start." I should have walked away, let her stew in her entitlement. But something about her, the frustration in her eyes, the way she folded her arms like she was trying to keep herself together, made me pause. "Pop the hood," I sighed, rolling up my sleeves. "Let me take a look." She huffed, but did as I asked. The engine was a mess, flooded, likely from the rain. "Battery's dead," I muttered. "You leave the lights on?" She scoffed. Do I look like someone who'd make that mistake? I bit my tongue. Instead of arguing, I pulled out my phone. "I can call a tow." "No time." "Fix it." She was impossible. But my mother always told me that kindness wasn't about who deserved it. It was about who needed it. So I stayed, kneeling in the rain, fingers freezing, trying to fix a car that wasn't mine, for a woman who didn't even thank me. "Are you done yet?" she asked impatiently, shaking raindrops off her coat like they were an insult. I gritted my teeth. Almost. Minutes passed, and my hand were numb by the time I got her battery connected to my old secondhand charger. The car roared to life, and the moment it did, she climbed inside, barely sparing me a glance. No thank you, no gratitude. But just as she was about to drive off, something stopped her. She stared at me through the windshield, eyes narrowing like she was seeing me for the first time. Then, rolling down the window, she asked, "Where do you work?" I frowned. "The diner on 8th. She didn't react, just nodded. "Noted." Then, she sped off, leaving me drenched and confused. The next day at work, I was sweeping the floors when the front door opened, letting in a gust of cold wind. And her. She walked in like she owned the place. And then I realized she did. The moment our manager, Tom, saw her, his face drained of color. He rushed to her side, stammering, "Ms. Sinclair." What a surprise. I froze. Sinclair. As in Ava Sinclair, heiress to the Sinclair Group, the company that owned this entire chain of restaurants. I had unknowingly helped the most powerful woman in our industry. She scanned the room before her eyes landed on me. "You," she said, walking straight toward me. I swallowed. "Me? Come with me." My heart pounded. This couldn't be good. Ava led me to the manager's office, shutting the door behind her. "I was rude yesterday," she said bluntly. "I don't apologize often, so don't expect me to start now." I arched a brow. "Noted." She smirked. "I like your attitude, but that's not why I'm here." She tossed a folder onto the desk. "You fixed my car. You didn't have to, but you did. I don't forget debts." I stared at her. "Debts? I'm offering you a position," she said. "Not here. At one of our higher-end locations. Better pay, better benefits." I blinked. "Why?" "Because people like you don't belong in places like this." Her words stung more than they should have. But before I could respond, she leaned in. "Take it or leave it." My pride screamed at me to refuse. But my hunger, my exhaustion, my reality told me otherwise. I took the deal. And just like that, my life changed. Working at the high-end restaurant was nothing like my old diner. It was ruthless, cutthroat. The customers expected perfection, and the staff was trained to deliver it. Ava watched me closely, testing me, pushing me. I learned fast. I learned that money didn't make people better. It just made them more dangerous. But I also learned that Ava wasn't as heartless as she seemed. One night, after closing, I found her sitting alone in the empty restaurant, a glass of untouched wine in front of her. "You ever get tired of it?" I asked. She glanced at me. "Of what?" "Being rich." She chuckled. "You'd think it solves problems, wouldn't you?" "Doesn't it?" She swirled her wine. "Only the small ones." For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't arrogance. Loneliness. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe Ava Sinclair was just as lost as the rest of us. Things are going well. Too well. One day, a rumor spread that I was only there because Ava liked me, that I was her charity case. I ignored it, Until the day I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to. Ava, speaking to someone on the phone. Yeah, he's doing fine. No, it's not permanent. Just giving him a little push. No, he's not cut out for this. My stomach dropped. She didn't believe in me. To her, I was just some stray she had picked up off the street. I walked away before she could see me. And that night, I made a decision. I was going to prove her wrong. I worked harder, smarter. I learned everything about the business. Management, finance, supply chains. I networked, built connections. And when the time was right, I made my move. A rival company was looking for fresh talent. I reached out, and they offered me something I never thought possible. A chance to own something. When I walked into Ava's office to resign, she looked more shocked than I had ever seen her. You're leaving? She asked. Yes. To them, yes. For the first time, she looked lost. Why? She whispered. I leaned in, repeating the words she had once said to me. Because people like me don't belong in places like this. Then I walked out. Months later, the Sinclair Group faced a crisis. A scandal. Financial losses. And the rival company I had joined, we were thriving. I should have felt victorious. Instead, when I saw Ava at a press conference, looking exhausted and defeated, I felt something else. Pity. She had given me a chance. Whether it was out of arrogance or kindness, it didn't matter. And now, she was the one drowning. So, I did something no one expected. I walked in her office and said, let's talk. She stared at me. Then, slowly she smiled. Maybe kindness wasn't just about who deserved it. Maybe it was about who needed it. And in that moment, we weren't rivals. We were just two people trying to survive. Ava sat motionless, eyes locked onto mine as if trying to decipher some hidden motive behind my words. The Ava Sinclair I had come to know never accepted help. She offered it, always from a position of power. And yet, here she was, stripped of that power, her empire cracking beneath her, and I had just extended my hand. She leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping idly against the desk. I don't need charity, she said finally, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. This isn't charity, Ava. This is business. Her lips twitched, almost like she wanted to smirk, but something held her back. Maybe it was the realization that, this time, I was the one calling the shots. And what do you want in return, then? She asked, eyes narrowing slightly. Because you don't strike me as the type to just give something away. She wasn't wrong. Months ago, I was the one looking up at her from the gutter, clinging onto the scraps of opportunity she threw my way. Now, the tables had turned, and she knew it. She was testing me, searching for weakness, waiting for me to fumble and give her an excuse to push me away. But I wasn't that naive, struggling waiter anymore. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Your company is hemorrhaging money, losing investors left and right. The Sinclair Group is one bad quarter away from collapse, and we both know it. But I can help turn it around, if you're willing to listen. She exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. And what do you get out of it? I held her gaze. A seat at the table. Her eyes darkened with something unreadable. Anger, perhaps? Or was it something else entirely? For a long moment, she just stared at me, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She wasn't the type to trust easily, and for good reason. But at the same time, she wasn't stupid. She knew that without help, the empire her family had built would crumble, and I was the only person willing to stand beside her. Finally, she let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. You really don't back down, do you? No, I said simply. I don't. A smirk pulled at the corner of her lips, though it was tinged with something else. Reluctance, maybe even admiration. Fine, she said. Let's talk. We spent hours locked in that office, going over the mess that was Sinclair Group's financials. It was worse than I expected. The company wasn't just struggling, it was dying. Years of reckless expansion, overpaid executives, and bad investments had left it barely treading water. I skimmed through the reports, shaking my head. You need to cut costs now, trim the fat, get rid of dead weight. Ava scoffed, crossing her arms. That's what the previous CEO tried. It didn't work. Because they cut from the wrong places, I shot back. You're losing money at the top, not the bottom. Your board members are lining their pockets while your restaurants are running on fumes. You need a clean house. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just watched me, her expression guarded. "You talk like you actually care," she murmured. I frowned. "This isn't about caring. It's about survival. You gave me a shot when no one else did. Now, I'm giving you one. Don't waste it." Her gaze lingered on me for a beat too long before she finally nodded. "All right," she said, almost reluctantly. "Let's do this." And just like that, we became something neither of us ever expected. Partners. It was brutal. Cutting out the rot in the Sinclair Group wasn't as simple as just firing a few corrupt executives. The entire board was infected with greed, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. But I didn't care. I came in with the same ruthless energy that Ava had once shown me, calling out every wasted expense, every inflated salary, every underperforming asset that was dragging the company into the dirt. And Ava, she backed me up. I watched as she dismantled men twice her age in board meetings, cutting through their excuses with cold precision. She was relentless, and for the first time, I realized that under all the arrogance and steel, there was something else. A survivor. "You enjoy this, don't you?" I asked one night after a particularly brutal meeting. She arched a brow. "You don't." I shrugged. "I enjoy winning." She smirked. "Then we'll get along just fine." And we did. For the first time, we weren't just two people from opposite worlds colliding. We were building something together. And it was exhilarating. Things were finally looking up. The Sinclair Group was stabilizing. Investors were starting to return. And for the first time, I felt like I actually belonged in this world. And then, I overheard something that changed everything. Late one night, I was heading to the office when I heard voices inside. Ava's voice. And another, one I didn't recognize. "You've done well," the voice said. Bringing him in was the right move. My stomach twisted. "You don't think he suspects anything?" the voice continued. Ava's silence was deafening. I felt my blood turn to ice. Had this all been a game to her? Had I been nothing more than a pawn in her grand strategy? I clenched my fists. I had come too far to be played like that again. If she wanted a war, she was about to get one. The next morning, I made my move. I pulled every contact I had, every favor I was owed, and I did the unthinkable. I started my own restaurant chain, and I took her best talent with me. Ava didn't see it coming. One by one, her restaurant started losing their top managers, their best chefs. Investors who had once put their money in a Sinclair Group now turned to me instead. And in just a few short months, I became her biggest competition. When she finally stormed into my office, her eyes burning with rage, I was ready. "You knew," I said coldly. "You used me." Her jaw tightened. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me," I said, leaning forward. "What was it like, Ava?" For once, she didn't have an answer. I should have walked away. I should have let her empire crumble. But something inside me, something I couldn't name, held me back. So I made her a final offer. "Merge with me," I said. "We do this together, or you watch everything fall apart." She stared at me, her expression unreadable. And then, after a long, excruciating moment, she nodded. We built something new, something neither of us could have done alone. And as I stood beside her, watching our empire rise, I realized something. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about redemption. For both of us. Ava didn't speak right away. She just stared at me, her fingers resting on the edge of my desk, gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The tension between us was suffocating, thick with everything unsaid. The betrayals, the power struggles, the undeniable chemistry that neither of us dared to acknowledge. "You really think I'm just going to merge with you?" she finally said, voice laced with disbelief. After everything, I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "Yes," she scoffed, shaking her head. "Unbelievable." "What's unbelievable?" I asked calmly. "That I'm giving you a way out? That I'm willing to let bygones be bygones, even after you try to play me?" I paused, letting my words sink in before I delivered the final blow. "Or is it the fact that you need me now?" Her jaw clenched. That last part hit home. She didn't need me. The Sinclair Group was still standing, but it was weaker than ever. My company had siphoned off its best talent, its best investors. The once unshakable empire was now wobbling on unsteady ground, and we both knew it was only a matter of time before it collapsed completely. And yet, despite all of that, she was still Ava Sinclair, prideful, stubborn, infuriatingly difficult. She would rather watch her legacy burn to the ground than admit she couldn't fix it alone. Her eyes flicked toward the city skyline visible from my office window. It was past midnight, and the streets below were alive with the glow of headlights and neon signs. She sighed, rubbing a hand over her face before pinning me with a look. "If we do this, I have conditions," she said. I smirked. "Of course you do. I don't answer to you." "That's funny," I mused. I was going to say the same thing. She ignored me. "We don't gut the Sinclair brand. We rebuild it." I nodded. "Agreed. But only if you agree to overhaul management. No more leeches bleeding the company dry." She hesitated, but then nodded. "Fine." I tilted my head slightly. "Anything else?" Her eyes met mine, something unspoken flickering in them. "Yeah," she said quietly. "If you screw me over, I'll burn you to the ground." I chuckled. "That's fair." A tense silence settled between us before she finally extended her hand. It was an olive branch wrapped in steel, a silent admission that she was willing to put the past behind us for now. I took her hand in mine, feeling the warmth of her skin, the strength in her grip. And just like that, war turned into something else entirely. A partnership, for better or worse. Merging our businesses was easier said than done. For the first few weeks, it felt less like a partnership and more like a battlefield. Ava and I fought over everything: staffing decisions, rebranding, marketing strategies. She wanted to stick to tradition. I wanted to innovate. She wanted to focus on luxury. I wanted to make the brand more accessible. We yelled. We argued. And yet, at the end of the day, we still sat across from each other in the same boardroom, working toward the same goal. One night, after a particularly brutal meeting with investors, we found ourselves alone in my office. I was nursing a glass of whiskey, exhaustion settling into my bones, when she sat down across from me. "You really don't stop, do you?" she muttered. I looked up. "Excuse me." She leaned back, studying me. "Most people would have taken their win and walked away. But not you." I swirled the amber liquid in my glass. "I don't like leaving things unfinished." A ghost of a smile tugged at her lips. "Neither do I." I met her gaze, something electric passing between us. For the first time since this all began, I realized that Ava and I weren't so different after all. And that terrified me more than anything. Just when things were starting to stabilize, trouble found us again. Or rather, someone found us. It happened during a routine investor dinner. Ava and I were presenting our new business strategy when an older man approached our table, his expression unreadable. Ava stiffened the moment she saw him. Her fingers clenched around her wine glass. "Father," she said coldly. I blinked, taken aback. This was the infamous Richard Sinclair, the man who had built the Sinclair empire from the ground up, only to leave it in the hands of a daughter he clearly didn't believe in. He ignored me entirely, his sharp gaze fixed on Ava. "So, this is what you've been up to," he said, voice laced with disapproval. "Merging with your competition? Diluting the brand?" Ava's expression didn't falter, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "I'm saving the company. Something you failed to do." His eyes darkened. "You're ruining everything I built." "No," she said, voice steady. "I'm making it better." I stayed silent, watching the exchange. This wasn't my fight. At least, not yet. Richard turned his gaze on me, then, his lip curling slightly. "And you, the boy from the gutter?" I raised a brow. "I prefer self-made entrepreneur." His smirk was condescending. "You think you can fix what you don't understand?" I smiled. "I know I can." Ava's father studied me for a long moment before scoffing. "We'll see about that." And just like that, the past came crashing back into Ava's life. The question was, would she be strong enough to face it? After that night, Ava changed. She was colder, more withdrawn. She started questioning my decisions, second-guessing her strategy. And worst of all, she started listening to her father. I confronted her one evening after another tense meeting. "You're letting him get to you," I said bluntly. She tensed. "I'm not." "Yes, you are." I stepped closer. "You've spent your whole life trying to prove yourself to him. And now that he's back, you're letting him undo everything we've built." Her eyes flashed. "This isn't about him." I scoffed. "Then what is it about, Ava?" "Because last time I checked, we were in this together." She swallowed hard, something flickering in her gaze. Uncertainty, vulnerability. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. Tensions reached their peak when I found out that Ava had been having secret meetings with her father. Meetings I hadn't been invited to. Meetings where they discussed restructuring the company. Without me. I stormed into her office, throwing the reports on her desk. What the hell is this? She looked up, startled. It's not what you think. Really? Because it looks like you're cutting me out. Her lips parted, but she didn't deny it. That was all the confirmation I needed. I exhaled sharply, stepping back. You know what? I'm done. Her eyes widened. Wait. But I was already walking away. Because this time, I wasn't going to be the one left behind. Days passed. Then weeks. I expected Ava to let me go. But she didn't. One night, she showed up at my door, rain-drenched and breathless. I was wrong, she admitted. I'll let my father get in my head. But I don't want to do this without you. I studied her, searching for any sign of deception. There was none. Finally, I exhaled. Then let's do it our way. And for the first time, I knew this wasn't just business anymore. This was something more.